I thought I knew everything about Connor. That sounds dramatic, but when you've been friends with someone for almost 15 years, you start believing there aren't many surprises left. I was wrong, because one rainy Friday night, Connor sat across from me in a nearly empty diner, stared into his untouched coffee for almost 10 minutes, and finally said something that completely changed the way I saw our entire friendship. "Owen, there's something I've been hiding from you for years." At the time, I honestly thought he was about to tell me he was secretly married, or in debt, or maybe moving across the country. What he actually confessed was something I'd never seen coming. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Connor and I met when we were 12. He was the new kid at school, tall for his age, quiet, awkward, the kind of kid who always looked like he wanted to disappear whenever a teacher called on him. I wasn't exactly popular either, so we naturally ended up becoming friends. One lunch period turned into years. Gaming after school, bike rides in the summer, late-night phone calls, road trips when we got older. The friendship just stuck. Life changed around us, but somehow Connor always remained part of it. People came and went. Relationships ended. Jobs changed. Apartments changed. Connor stayed. By 28, he was basically family. The funny thing was that despite knowing each other forever, Connor had always been incredibly private. Not secretive, just private. If something bothered him, he'd keep it to himself. If he was struggling, nobody knew. Meanwhile, I was the opposite. If I had a bad day, Connor heard about it. If I was excited about something, Connor heard about it. If I made a terrible dating decision, which happened more often than I'd like to admit, Connor definitely heard about it. For years, our friendship worked that way. I talked. Connor listened. Looking back now, maybe I should have noticed how one-sided that was. Maybe I should have realized sooner that there were entire parts of his life he never shared. But when you've known someone forever, you stop questioning things. You assume you know them. You assume there aren't any major surprises left. Then came the wedding. Not mine. My younger sister's. A huge family event that somehow turned into one of the most important weekends of my life. Connor came as my plus one. Not in a romantic way, just because he was practically family. Everyone expected him to be there. My mom adored him. My sister adored him. Even my uncle kept asking where Connor was whenever he missed family gatherings. So naturally he came. The wedding itself was beautiful. Outdoor ceremony. Perfect weather. Too much champagne. The usual. Connor looked annoyingly good in a suit. Not that I thought much about it. Okay, maybe I noticed. But Connor had always been one of those guys who cleaned up surprisingly well. We spent most of the reception hanging around together, laughing, making fun of terrible dance moves, avoiding distant relatives who wanted to ask uncomfortable questions about our dating lives. Normal stuff. At one point, my sister grabbed me before the first dance. "Can I ask you something?" "Depends." She smiled. "Are you and Connor ever going to figure it out?" I nearly choked on my drink. "Figure what out?" She rolled her eyes. "You know exactly what." "I genuinely don't." "Owen." I stared at her, then laughed. Hard. Because the idea seemed ridiculous. Connor was Connor. My best friend. That's it. Nothing to figure out. Nothing complicated. Nothing hidden. At least that's what I believed. My sister shook her head. "You two are impossible." Then she walked away before explaining. I forgot about the conversation almost immediately. Connor and I spent the rest of the evening talking with relatives, taking pictures, and eating way too much wedding cake. Nothing unusual happened, or at least nothing I noticed. A few weeks later, Connor started acting differently. Subtle things at first. He'd cancel plans. Not often. Just enough for me to notice. Sometimes he'd stare off during conversations. Other times he'd seem distracted, like something was constantly occupying his thoughts. Whenever I asked, he brushed it off. Just tired. Work stress. Nothing important. I believed him, until one night. It was late October. Cold. Rain hammering against my apartment windows. Connor texted me around 9. "Can we talk?" Simple message. But something about it immediately felt wrong. "Everything okay?" Several minutes passed. Then, not really. That got my attention. Connor never admitted when something was wrong. Ever. I called him instantly. He didn't answer. Instead, another message appeared. Can we meet somewhere? An hour later, we were sitting across from each other inside a 24-hour diner. The place was nearly empty. Couple truck drivers. An exhausted waitress. Soft music playing through old speakers. Connor looked nervous. Actually nervous. I'd seen him calm through breakups, family emergencies, job losses. But this was different. His hands wouldn't stop moving. He kept looking down, looking away, starting sentences and abandoning them halfway through. Finally, I leaned forward. Connor. He looked up. What? You're freaking me out. A small laugh escaped him. Sorry. What's going on? Silence. Long silence. Then he rubbed both hands across his face. I've been trying to tell you something for years. I frowned. What kind of something? His eyes met mine. For a second, I saw genuine fear there. Not anxiety. Fear. Like whatever he was about to say could destroy everything. And suddenly my stomach dropped. Because in that moment I realized this wasn't about work. Or family. Or money. This was something much bigger. Connor took a shaky breath. Then said quietly, Owen. If I tell you, I don't know if you'll ever look at me the same way again. And for the first time in 15 years, I had absolutely no idea what my best friend was about to say. Connor's words hung between us. If I tell you, I don't know if you'll ever look at me the same way again. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, rain slid down the diner windows in steady streams, blurring the glow of passing headlights. I tried to laugh it off. Connor, you're acting like you're about to confess to murder. A small smile appeared, then disappeared. Yeah, that wasn't reassuring. I sat back in my booth. Whatever it is, just tell me. His fingers tightened around his coffee mug, then loosened again. 3 times he opened his mouth. 3 times he stopped himself. I was starting to get frustrated. Connor. He looked up. I mean it. Just say it. His jaw tightened. Then he nodded. Slowly, like he was forcing himself forward. You remember when we were 16? I blinked. That's a very broad question. The summer your parents rented that cabin. Immediately I remembered. The lake, the fishing trips, the bonfires. 2 weeks of freedom before school started again. Connor and I had spent practically every day together. Yeah, I said. What about it? He stared into his coffee. That's when it started. I frowned. What started? Silence. Then, my feelings for you. The words landed so softly that for a second I thought I'd misheard them. My brain simply refused to process them. Connor finally looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw absolutely nowhere to hide in his expression. No jokes, no sarcasm, no escape, just honesty, raw honesty. My chest tightened. Connor. He laughed quietly, a sad laugh. There it is. What? That look. I hadn't realized my expression had changed. Honestly, I wasn't even sure what expression I was making. Shock maybe, confusion, something else. I knew you'd react like that. I don't know how I'm reacting. Exactly. Neither of us moved. The waitress came by to refill our coffee. Neither of us touched it. When she left, Connor spoke again. I wasn't planning to tell you. His voice sounded steadier now, like the hardest part was over. I spent years convincing myself I could keep it buried. I stared at him, trying to connect this version of Connor with the one I'd known forever. The one who'd helped me move apartments. The one who'd sat beside me after breakups. The one who'd spent every birthday, every holiday, every major life event by my side. How had I missed this? How had I never known? You liked me since we were 16? Connor nodded. I leaned back, trying to remember, trying to see signs that maybe I'd overlooked. But nothing obvious came to mind. Back then we'd been inseparable. Every weekend together. Every school break together. Nothing unusual. Nothing that screamed hidden feelings. Then again, Maybe that was because I'd never been looking. Connor rubbed his palms together. I didn't expect anything. I stayed quiet. I knew you were gay. That surprised me. You knew. Years before you told anyone. Now I stared. What? A small smile appeared. Owen, you weren't exactly subtle. For the first time since arriving, I laughed. A real laugh. Connor smiled too. The tension eased slightly. Only slightly. I figured it out junior year. Why didn't you say anything? He shrugged. Because it wasn't my secret. That sounded exactly like him. Painfully considerate. Painfully careful. The kind of thing Connor would absolutely do. I wanted you to tell me when you were ready. Something twisted in my chest. Because suddenly I realized he'd been carrying two secrets at once. Mine and his own. For years. Neither of us spoke for a while. Rain continued tapping against the windows. A truck rumbled past outside. Finally, I asked the question that had been building in my head. Why tell me now? Connor looked away. And immediately I knew there was more. A lot more. His shoulders rose and fell. Then he laughed softly. You really want to know? Obviously. His eyes met mine. And something in his expression made my stomach drop. Because there was sadness there. Not regret. Sadness. The kind that comes from accepting something painful. I met someone. I froze. The reaction surprised even me. Something sharp hit my chest. Brief. Confusing. Gone almost instantly. Oh. Connor nodded. His name's Ethan. For reasons I couldn't explain, hearing the actual name made it worse. I didn't understand why. I shouldn't have cared. Connor deserved happiness. If anything, I should have been happy for him. Instead, I felt strangely unsettled. And I hated that. Connor noticed. Of course he noticed. He always noticed everything about me. We've been seeing each other for 3 months. 3 months. 3 months? I blinked. You have a boyfriend? The word sounded ridiculous coming out of my mouth. Connor laughed. Yeah. And you didn't tell me? His smile faded. There wasn't exactly a good way to explain why I'd hidden him. The realization hit immediately. Right? Because explaining Ethan meant explaining everything else. All the years. All the feelings. All the secrets. I looked down at the table, trying to organize my thoughts, trying to figure out what exactly I was feeling. The truth was that I wasn't upset Connor liked men. That wasn't the issue. And I wasn't upset he'd fallen for me years ago. I couldn't control how someone felt. No, what hurt was something else. Something I couldn't fully define. Maybe it was the fact that my best friend had been carrying this alone. Or maybe it was realizing there were entire chapters of his life I'd never been allowed to read. Connor exhaled slowly. I should have told you sooner. I looked up. Why didn't you? A long silence followed. Then he answered. Because being around you was already hard enough. The words hit harder than they should have. Connor's gaze drifted toward the rain-streaked window. You were my favorite person. His voice was quiet, careful. I got used to living with it. I couldn't think of a response. Nothing felt right. Nothing felt big enough. So we sat there, two friends who suddenly felt like strangers. Not because we didn't know each other, but because we were finally seeing things we'd never been allowed to see before. Then Connor said something that completely blindsided me. Something that changed the entire conversation. Something that made everything even more complicated. I wasn't actually planning to tell you tonight. I frowned. Then why did you? Connor looked directly into my eyes and said, because Ethan asked me a question yesterday. My stomach tightened. What question? Connor swallowed, then quietly answered. He asked if I was still in love with you. The words hit me harder than I expected. He asked if I was still in love with you. For a second, everything around us seemed to fade into the background. The rain, the diner, the music, all of it. I just stared at Connor. What did you tell him? Connor looked exhausted, like he'd already replayed this conversation 1,000 times in his head. I told him no. Something in my chest tightened. I didn't know why. Was it true? Connor didn't answer immediately, and that silence told me everything. A slow breath escaped him. I don't know. The honesty of that answer hurt more than if he'd lied. Not because of what it meant, because of how difficult it must have been to say. Connor had always been honest with me, even when it wasn't easy, especially when it wasn't easy. I care about Ethan, he continued. A lot. I nodded. But? Connor laughed quietly. You always know when there's a but. Because there's always a but. His smile appeared briefly, then vanished. But every time I started getting serious with someone, he paused. I compared them to you. I looked away, suddenly fascinated by the sugar packets on the table. The truth was I didn't know how to handle any of this. Part of me felt guilty, another part felt sad, and another part felt something I couldn't quite identify. Connor leaned back. I hated myself for it. I looked up. What? For years. His eyes stayed fixed on the table. I wanted to move on. His voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes after years of fighting the same battle. I dated other people. He shrugged. Some were great. A small smile appeared. One guy stole my favorite hoodie. I laughed despite myself. Connor smiled too. But eventually every relationship ended for the same reason. I already knew the answer. Still, I asked. Because of me? Connor nodded. The guilt returned instantly. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Owen. I looked up. This isn't your fault. His voice was firm. You didn't do anything wrong. I still feel like I did. You didn't. But. No. The seriousness in his tone surprised me. Connor rarely interrupted people. Especially me. You don't get to blame yourself for feelings I never told you about. I sat quietly, because he was right. Logically, I knew he was right. Emotionally, that was harder. The waitress dropped off our bill. Neither of us reached for it. Neither of us seemed ready to leave. After a while, I asked, So what happens now? Connor stared at the window. I honestly don't know. The answer felt painfully real. No dramatic speech. No perfect solution. Just uncertainty. The kind adults never warn you about. The kind that sneaks into friendships and changes everything. Finally, Connor stood. I should probably go. I nodded automatically. Neither of us moved toward the door. Then Connor surprised me again. Can I ask you something? Sure. His expression became unreadable. Careful. Guarded. Almost nervous. When your sister asked if we were ever going to figure it out, my eyes widened. You heard that. Unfortunately, I groaned. Of course you did. Connor actually laughed. The sound felt strangely comforting. Normal. Familiar. Then his smile faded. What did you think she meant? I opened my mouth, then stopped, because suddenly I wasn't sure. At the wedding, I dismissed it immediately. The question had seemed ridiculous. But now I wasn't certain. Connor watched me carefully, waiting, and the longer I took to answer, the more uncomfortable I became. Finally, I shrugged. I thought she was being weird. Connor nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. But something about his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. We paid the bill, walked outside. The rain had mostly stopped. The streets glistened beneath yellow streetlights. For years, moments with Connor had been easy, comfortable. Tonight, everything felt different. Every silence felt heavier. Every glance lasted longer. Every word carried more meaning. We stood beside our cars. Neither of us seemed eager to leave. Connor shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. I should have told you sooner. I shook my head. Maybe. His eyes met mine. But, I sighed. But I'm glad you told me. That earned a genuine smile. A small one, but real. Me too. Then he hesitated. And for the first time all night, he looked scared again. Owen? Yeah. If you need space. The fact that he'd even considered that hurt. I immediately shook my head. No. Connor looked surprised. No. You're still Connor. His shoulders relaxed slightly. The tension in his face eased. And for a second, I saw the friend I'd known since I was 12. The same Connor, just carrying truths I'd never known. He nodded. Okay. Then he got into his car. I watched him drive away, and I stood there long after his taillights disappeared, trying to process everything, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. The obvious feeling should have been shock, maybe even awkwardness. Instead, what I felt most was loss. Not because Connor had confessed, because I suddenly realized how much of his life I'd missed. All those years, all those moments, all those struggles, and I hadn't seen any of it. The drive home was a blur. I barely slept that night. Every memory of Connor kept replaying in my head. The cabin when we were 16, road trips, movie nights, birthdays, Christmases, thousands of moments. And now every memory seemed slightly different. Not ruined, just changed, viewed through a new lens. Around 3 in the morning, my phone buzzed. A message from my sister. How did dinner with Connor go? I stared at the screen, then typed. You knew. 3 dots appeared immediately, then finally figured it out. Huh? I sat upright in bed, heart racing, and suddenly I realized something that made my stomach drop. My sister hadn't been surprised. Not even a little, which meant other people might have noticed too. Other people might have seen something I'd completely missed. And for the first time, I started wondering whether Connor's secret was the only thing I'd been blind to all these years. I called my sister the next morning. The second she answered, I skipped the greeting. What did you know? She laughed. Not exactly the response I wanted. Good morning to you too. Seriously? Owen. What? You sound stressed. I rubbed my eyes. I slept maybe 3 hours. Just answer the question. There was a pause. Then her voice softened. Connor told you? Yeah. Another pause. Oh. I sat down on the edge of my bed. How long have you known? I didn't know. Then why weren't you surprised? She sighed. Because I'm not blind. That answer wasn't helpful. Meaning Connor looked at you differently. My stomach tightened. What does that even mean? Exactly what it sounds like. I stared at the wall. Part of me wanted to argue. Another part knew she was being honest. Why didn't anyone tell me? She laughed again. Because it wasn't our business. That sounded familiar. Almost exactly like Connor's answer about my own coming out years ago. Not your secret. Not your business. Funny how life worked. After hanging up, I spent most of the day distracted. Work emails piled up. Messages went unanswered. My brain kept circling back to Connor. By evening, I finally gave up pretending to be productive. I grabbed dinner, watched half a movie, couldn't focus. Eventually, I opened social media. Huge mistake. Connor had posted something. A photo. Nothing special. Just him standing beside another guy. Both smiling. The caption was simple. Weekend getaway. That was it. No dramatic announcement. No relationship status. Nothing. Just a picture. I stared at it longer than I should have. Ethan. For the first time, I saw him. Dark hair. Friendly smile. One arm resting casually against Connor's shoulder. They looked happy. Normal. Comfortable together. The photo should have made me feel relieved. Instead, something strange settled in my chest. Not jealousy. At least I didn't think it was jealousy. Felt more like being left behind. I hated that thought immediately. Connor was allowed to move forward with his life. Allowed to find someone. Allowed to be happy. So why did the photo bother me? I closed the app, then opened it again 5 minutes later, just to look one more time, which was ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. The following week was awkward. Not because Connor made it awkward. Actually, he acted exactly the same. Same texts, same jokes, same friendship. The problem was me. Now I noticed everything. The way he listened when I spoke. The way he remembered tiny details. The way he always checked that I got home safely after nights out. The way he'd quietly helped me through some of the worst moments of my life without ever asking for credit. Things I'd always taken for granted suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Friday night, Connor invited me to a trivia event at a local pub. Normally, I would have said yes immediately. This time I hesitated. Then I hated myself for hesitating. So I went. The second I walked inside, Connor waved from a table. And sitting beside him was Ethan. Of course, the boyfriend. I nearly turned around. Instead, I forced a smile and walked over. Connor stood. Owen. Something in his expression looked relieved, like he'd been worried I wouldn't come. This is Ethan. Ethan smiled and offered a hand. Nice to finally meet you. His tone was genuine, warm, friendly, which honestly made things worse. It would have been easier if he'd been terrible. Instead, he seemed like a genuinely good guy. The three of us spent the evening together. And to my annoyance, Ethan was hilarious. Quick-witted, easy to talk to, the kind of person who immediately fit into conversations. By the end of the night, I understood why Connor liked him, which should have made me happy. But every time Connor laughed at something Ethan said, I felt that same strange twist in my chest, the feeling I'd been trying to ignore all week. Around 10, Ethan left to meet friends. Suddenly, it was just me and Connor. Like old times, we sat outside beneath patio lights, the night air cool and comfortable. For a while, we talked about normal things, work, movies, random nonsense. Then Connor asked, "What do you think of him?" I knew exactly who he meant. "He's great." Connor smiled. "Yeah." The smile lingered, and for a second he looked genuinely happy. The kind of happy I'd rarely seen from him. That should have been enough. Instead, I heard myself asking, "Are you serious about him?" Connor looked surprised, then thoughtful. Maybe. The word hit harder than expected. "He makes me happy." I nodded, unable to find a response. Connor studied me, then suddenly frowned. "Owen, what? You're doing that thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you pretend everything's fine." I laughed, poorly. Connor wasn't fooled. Never had been. "What are you thinking?" I looked away, because the truthful answer sounded insane. The truthful answer was, "I don't know what's happening to me." Instead, I shrugged. "Nothing." Connor raised an eyebrow. Neither of us believed that. A long silence followed. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "You know what's funny?" "What?" His smile returned. "Sitting here talking about relationships with you." I laughed. "Why?" "Because for years I imagined this conversation differently." The honesty caught me off guard. Connor immediately looked embarrassed. "Sorry." "No." I shook my head. "It's okay." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly added, "I used to think if I ever told you, everything would change." I swallowed. "It has changed." Connor looked down. "Yeah. It doesn't mean we're losing each other." His eyes lifted, meeting mine. Something passed between us. Something I couldn't define. Something neither of us addressed. Then Connor smiled. A real smile. Good. The word should have brought relief. Instead, it brought panic. Because as I sat there looking at him beneath the warm patio lights, I realized something terrifying. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't completely sure what Connor was to me anymore. And that scared me far more than his confession ever had. The realization followed me everywhere. Work, home, the grocery store, even the gym. No matter what I was doing, my mind kept circling back to Connor. Not his confession. Not even the years he'd spent hiding it. What bothered me was the question I couldn't answer. What exactly was Connor to me? For most of my life, that answer had been easy. Best friend, family, constant. Now every answer felt incomplete. And I hated that. 2 weeks passed. I did my best to ignore it. Connor did the same. We slipped back into our usual routine. Movie nights, texts, weekend plans, normal friendship, at least on the surface. Then Thanksgiving arrived. My parents hosted as usual. Too much food. Too many relatives. The annual tradition. Connor had attended almost every Thanksgiving since high school. Nobody even questioned it anymore. He showed up carrying a pie my mother specifically requested every year. The second he walked through the door, my mom hugged him. "There's my favorite son." "Mom." "What?" She smiled innocently. "You know you're my second favorite." Connor laughed. I'll take second place. Everything felt familiar, comfortable, the way it always had. Until dinner. Somewhere between dessert and coffee, my uncle asked Connor about dating. A harmless question. At least he thought so. Connor glanced toward me briefly, then answered, I'm seeing someone. The entire table lit up immediately. Questions, comments, curiosity. My mother nearly dropped her fork. Connor had always been private. Most of my family couldn't remember the last time he'd talked about dating anyone. What's he like? My sister asked. Connor smiled. The smile was small, but genuine. He's good. The way he said it made me realize something. Connor really cared about Ethan. This wasn't casual. This wasn't temporary. This was real. And for some reason, that realization sat heavily in my chest. The rest of dinner blurred together. Eventually, everyone moved into the living room. Football played on television. Relatives scattered around the house. At some point, I stepped outside to get fresh air. The November cold hit instantly. Honestly, it felt good. I stood on the porch alone for several minutes. Then the door opened behind me. Connor, of course. You disappeared. I shrugged. Needed air. He joined me by the railing. For a while, we watched the quiet neighborhood. Christmas lights already glowing on nearby houses. Eventually, Connor spoke. You've been weird. I laughed. Direct. I'm serious. I knew he was. Connor had always known when something was bothering me. Usually before I knew myself. I don't know. That's not an answer. I smiled. See? This is why you're annoying. Connor laughed. I've known you too long. That was the problem. Way too long. Long enough that hiding things from each other suddenly felt impossible. I rubbed my hands together, trying to organize thoughts that refused to cooperate. Finally, I asked, Are you happy? Connor looked surprised. With Ethan? I nodded. His answer came immediately. Yeah. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just certainty. The kind I'd been struggling to find for weeks. That should have settled everything. Instead, something inside me sank. Connor noticed. Of course he noticed. His expression changed. Slightly. Barely. But I saw it. And for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he quietly asked, Owen, are you upset because I told you? No. Then why are you upset? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Because I genuinely didn't know. Or maybe I did. Maybe I just wasn't ready to say it out loud. The silence stretched. Then Connor surprised me. Again. You know what Ethan said? I looked over. What? Connor leaned against the railing. He thinks you're scared. I laughed immediately. Of what? Change. The answer landed harder than expected. Because deep down, I knew he was right. Everything had changed. Not just because of the confession. Because for the first time, Connor's future didn't automatically include me at the center of it. That thought felt selfish and unfair, but it was true. For years, we'd been constants in each other's lives. Now there was someone else, someone important, someone Connor loved. The realization forced me to confront something uncomfortable. Maybe I'd never appreciated how much space Connor occupied in my life until I thought about losing it. The cold air suddenly felt heavier. Connor shoved his hands into his pockets. I'm not going anywhere. I looked at him. What? A small smile appeared. You look like someone just told you I'm moving to another planet. I laughed despite myself. Maybe. His smile widened, then slowly faded. Owen. Yeah. You know you're important to me, right? The words hit unexpectedly hard. I looked away, toward the street, toward anything except him. Because suddenly my chest felt tight, uncomfortably tight, and I didn't understand why. A long silence followed. Then Connor quietly added, You always will be. For some reason, that almost made things worse. Because instead of relief, all I felt was confusion. Confusion and fear. Fear that I was finally realizing something years too late. Fear that maybe my sister had been right all along. Fear that maybe I hadn't been as blind as I thought. Maybe I'd noticed things over the years. Tiny things. small moments, and simply chosen not to examine them. That night, after everyone went home, I couldn't sleep. Around 1 in the morning, I opened an old photo album on my phone. Years of memories, thousands of pictures. Connor was in almost all of them. School, college, birthdays, road trips, random weekends, entire chapters of my life. The further I scrolled, the more one uncomfortable truth became impossible to ignore. Every major memory I treasured seemed to include him. Every important moment, every turning point, Connor was always there. And suddenly I found myself wondering something I should have asked a long time ago. Not whether Connor had loved me. I already knew that answer. The question keeping me awake was far worse. Had I spent years loving him too, without realizing it? I spent the next several days trying to convince myself I was overthinking everything. It wouldn't have been the first time. I had a talent for turning simple situations into emotional puzzles. So I told myself exactly that. You're confused. Connor confessed. Things changed. That's all this is. The problem was that explanation stopped working the moment I saw him. Because every time Connor walked into a room, every carefully constructed argument in my head fell apart. And I hated how obvious it was becoming. A week later, Connor called. Road trip. I frowned. What? Road trip? That's not a complete sentence. It is if you've known someone for 15 years. I laughed despite myself. Where? 3 hours north. Why? Because I've had a terrible week. Fair. And because you sound like you're having an existential crisis. I stared at my phone. That's rude. So is lying. Couldn't even argue. By Saturday morning, we were driving north. Just like we had done dozens of times before. Coffee cups. Bad music. Random conversations. For the first hour, everything felt normal. Comfortable. Familiar. The way it always had. Then Connor ruined it. Completely accidentally. We stopped at a gas station. I went inside. Bought snacks. When I came back, Connor was sitting in the driver's seat scrolling through his phone. Smiling. Not a polite smile. Not an amused smile. A happy one. The kind you don't fake. The kind that appears when you're talking to someone you genuinely care about. I already knew who it was. Ethan. Connor looked up. Ready. I nodded. But something about that moment stuck with me. Not because Connor was happy. Because I realized I wanted to be the reason for that smile. The thought hit so hard I nearly dropped my drink. The rest of the drive was torture. Because once the realization arrived, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Every memory I'd spent weeks analyzing suddenly looked different. Not because Connor had loved me. Because somewhere along the way, I'd started loving him too. I just hadn't recognized it. Or maybe I hadn't allowed myself to. Maybe it had always been easier to call it friendship. Safer. Simpler. Connor was my constant. My favorite person. The first call when something good happened. The first call when something bad happened. The person I wanted beside me during every important moment. How had I never questioned that? The answer was simple. Because he'd always been there. You don't always notice something essential until you imagine losing it. That evening we reached a small lakeside town we'd visited years ago. The place hadn't changed. Same cabins. Same restaurants. Same walking paths beside the water. After dinner, we wandered down to the lake. The sun was setting. Orange light reflecting across the water. Connor shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. Remember when we got lost here? I laughed. We weren't lost. We absolutely were. We found our way back. 6 hours later, I smiled. The memory felt warm, comforting. Then Connor looked at me, really looked at me, and immediately his smile faded. What? I asked. He hesitated. You figured something out. My stomach dropped. How did he do that? Every single time. Maybe. Connor nodded slowly, not pushing, just waiting, the way he always did. Patient, steady, safe. And suddenly I couldn't carry it anymore. The confusion, the uncertainty, the fear. It all came rushing out. I think I've been an idiot. Connor blinked. That's a strong opening. I laughed. a nervous laugh, then looked out at the lake, unable to meet his eyes. After your confession, I kept asking myself why it bothered me. Silence. I told myself it was because things changed. Connor stayed quiet, listening, always listening. But that wasn't it. My pulse was racing now. Every instinct screamed at me to stop talking, to run, to protect myself. Instead, I kept going. Because for the first time in weeks, I knew the truth. I wasn't upset because you loved me. The words hung in the air. Connor didn't move, didn't speak. I finally looked at him. His expression had gone completely still. And suddenly I knew he understood exactly where this was heading. My throat tightened. I was upset because someone else got there first. For a second, neither of us breathed. The lake, the wind, the distant sounds of town. Everything seemed to disappear. Connor stared at me, completely stunned. Owen. His voice barely worked. I laughed weakly. Yeah. Neither of us knew what to say, because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. Not after all these years. Not after Ethan. Not after Connor had finally started moving forward. The silence stretched painfully. Then Connor looked away, and the expression on his face broke my heart. Because it wasn't happiness. It wasn't relief. It was sadness. Deep sadness. And immediately I knew why. Ethan. Connor nodded. The single word explained everything. All the timing. All the complications. All the reasons this wasn't simple. For years Connor had wanted this conversation. Now it had arrived at exactly the wrong moment. I care about him. His voice sounded heavy. Guilty. I know. I never wanted to hurt him. I know. Connor rubbed a hand across his face, looking more conflicted than I'd ever seen him. And standing there beside the lake, watching the man I'd loved without realizing its struggle between his past and present, I understood something painful. Confessing my feelings hadn't solved anything. It had only created a new problem. One neither of us knew how to fix. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The cold air coming off the lake seemed sharper now. Heavier. Connor stood beside me with both hands buried in his jacket pockets, staring out at the water. I could practically see the war happening inside his head. And honestly, I didn't blame him. If our positions had been reversed, I would have been just as conflicted. Maybe worse. Finally, Connor broke the silence. When did you figure it out? His voice was quiet, careful. I laughed softly. About 3 hours ago. That actually made him smile. A small one. Seriously. Seriously. I shook my head. I wish I could tell you there was some dramatic moment. Connor watched me. But there wasn't. The truth felt strangely embarrassing. I just realized that every future I imagine automatically includes you. His expression changed immediately. Not dramatically. Just enough. The kind of expression someone makes when they're trying very hard not to feel something. I know that sounds ridiculous. It doesn't. His answer came instantly, which somehow made everything worse. I swallowed, then asked the question I'd been avoiding. Do you still love me? Connor closed his eyes, just for a second, and that second was all the answer I needed. When he opened them again, there was no hiding, no pretending. No. The word hit me like a punch. Then he continued. Not the way I used to. I stared at him. Connor looked exhausted, emotionally exhausted, like he'd carried this conversation in his head for years. I spent a long time letting go. His voice remained steady. But letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. I nodded slowly, trying not to show how much that answer hurt, because it was fair, more than fair. For years, he'd wanted something that couldn't happen. Eventually, he'd been forced to move on. The tragedy was that I'd figured everything out after he'd finally succeeded. Connor stepped closer. Not enough to touch me. Just enough that I could see every emotion crossing his face. Part of me will probably always love you. The honesty nearly destroyed me. Connor. But that's not the same thing. He looked toward the lake, then back at me. You're not the only person who spent weeks confused. Something in his voice caught my attention. What do you mean? Connor laughed quietly, a sad laugh. The night you told me, my heart sped up. Yeah. For about 24 hours, I thought all my dreams had come true. The words hurt, not because of what they meant, because of how sincere they sounded. Connor shook his head, then smiled bitterly. And then reality showed up. Ethan. Again. Always Ethan. The person caught in the middle of all this. The person who hadn't done anything wrong. A heavy silence settled between us. Eventually I spoke. Do you love him? Connor didn't hesitate. Yeah. The answer was immediate, certain, real. And strangely, hearing it made something inside me settle. Painfully, but honestly, because if he'd hesitated, if he'd looked uncertain, I don't know what would have happened. But he didn't. Connor loved Ethan. That was the truth. And truth mattered. Even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. The drive back the next day felt different. Not awkward. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. For the first time in years, there were no secrets between us. No hidden feelings. No unanswered questions. Only reality. Complicated reality. A few days later, Connor called. I knew immediately from his voice that something had happened. What is it? Silence. Then, I told Ethan. My stomach dropped. Of course he had. Connor wasn't capable of hiding something that important. What happened? A long pause. He already knew. I blinked. What? Connor laughed. Actually laughed. He said he figured it out before either of us. That sounded annoyingly believable. Ethan might be smarter than both of us. That's not a high bar right now. Fair. For the first time in days, we both laughed. The tension eased slightly. Then Connor became quiet again. Owen. Yeah. I think we're taking a break. The words hit harder than expected. Not because I was happy. Because I wasn't. Not even close. I knew exactly what that meant. Connor and Ethan weren't breaking up because of a lack of feelings. They were breaking up because life had gotten messy, complicated, unfair, and sometimes that's worse. How's he doing? Connor was silent for several seconds. Then, better than me. That answer told me everything. The following weeks were difficult. For everyone. Connor looked exhausted, distracted, lost. I felt guilty every time I saw him. And through all of it, Ethan remained far kinder than he had any obligation to be, which only made me respect him more. By Christmas, almost 2 months had passed since the diner confession. The snow arrived early that year. The city looked beautiful, and for the first time since everything exploded, life finally seemed to be slowing down. I thought maybe the worst was behind us. Then Connor knocked on my apartment door 3 days before Christmas. The second I opened it, I knew something was different. He looked nervous, very nervous. And Connor almost never looked nervous anymore. Not around me. What happened? He laughed. Can I come in first? That definitely wasn't reassuring. A few minutes later, we sat across from each other in my living room. The exact same position we'd occupied 1,000 times before. Except this time felt different, important. Connor rubbed his palms together, then looked directly at me. I met Ethan today. My stomach tightened. And Connor smiled. A real smile. The first truly happy smile I'd seen from him in weeks. Then he said, he told me to stop being an idiot. And suddenly I had absolutely no idea where this conversation was going. I stared at Connor. He said what? Connor laughed. For the first time in weeks, it sounded genuine. Like, relieved. He told me to stop being an idiot. I leaned forward. Connor, you're skipping a lot of important details. Yeah, probably. Definitely. Connor rubbed the back of his neck. A nervous habit he'd had since we were teenagers. Then he finally started talking. I asked him to meet me. I stayed quiet, listening. He already knew things were complicated. Connor's smile faded slightly. We'd been talking. That surprised me. You were still talking? Connor nodded. Not much, but enough. I thought about Ethan, about how unbelievably patient he'd been through all of this. Most people would have walked away. Honestly, I wouldn't have blamed them. But Ethan wasn't most people. Connor looked down briefly, then continued. I apologized. For what? A humorless laugh escaped him. For basically turning his life upside down. Fair. Connor sighed. I told him he deserved someone who wasn't confused. And Connor smiled again. This time there was actual warmth behind it. He said confusion wasn't the problem. I frowned. What was? Connor looked directly at me. Fear. The word landed heavily, because I immediately understood. Not just Connor's fear. Mine too. For months we'd both been terrified of losing something. Our friendship. Each other. The life we'd built. And because of that fear, we'd spent years avoiding conversations we should have had a long time ago. Connor leaned back. Ethan told me something I can't stop thinking about. What? A small smile tugged at his mouth. He said the only reason he knew I still loved you was because of the way I talked about you. My chest tightened. Connor laughed softly. Apparently normal people don't tell 15 stories about their best friend during every conversation. I couldn't help smiling. That's fair, right? We sat quietly for a moment. Then I asked the question I was almost afraid to hear answered. What happened after that? Connor looked down, then back at me. He asked me something. I waited. He asked whether I was staying away from you because I loved him. Connor paused. Or because I was scared. The room felt very still. What did you say? Connor's eyes met mine. And for the first time since this whole mess began, there was no uncertainty there. No confusion. No conflict. Just clarity. I told him I was scared. A slow breath escaped me. Connor smiled sadly. Ethan told me fear is a terrible reason to walk away from someone. The silence that followed felt strangely peaceful. Like two people finally reaching the end of a very long road. After a while, I asked quietly, how's he doing? Connor smiled. The expression carried equal parts affection and gratitude. He's okay. I nodded. Relieved. Honestly relieved. Then Connor surprised me one last time. He also said something else. What? Connor shook his head, looking almost embarrassed. He said if two idiots spend 15 years in love with each other, eventually somebody has to do something about it. I laughed so hard I nearly fell off the couch. Connor joined in. For several seconds, neither of us could stop. And somehow that laughter broke the last remaining tension between us. The final wall. The final fear. Everything. When the laughter faded, silence settled between us again. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't heavy. Felt warm. Familiar. Home. Connor looked at me. Really looked at me. And suddenly I saw every version of him at once. The awkward 12-year-old who'd become my friend. The teenager who'd hidden impossible feelings. The man who'd stood beside me through every major moment of my life. The person who had always been there. Always. My favorite memories. My safest place. My best friend. And maybe something more than that. Maybe always something more than that. Connor's voice was barely above a whisper. So what now? I smiled. A real smile. The easiest smile I'd had in months. Then I stood up, walked across the room, and pulled him into a hug. Connor froze for half a second, then hugged me back, tightly. Neither of us spoke. Words suddenly felt unnecessary, because some things don't need explaining. Some things only need acknowledging. Eventually I pulled back. Connor looked nervous again, which was honestly adorable, and slightly ridiculous considering everything we'd already survived. I laughed. You're still Connor. His smile appeared immediately. And you're still Owen. Good. Good. For a moment we simply stood there, looking at each other. Then Connor shook his head. What? He laughed softly. I spent years imagining this. My heart sped up. Yeah. Turns out reality is way less dramatic. I smiled. Reality usually is. His eyes stayed on mine. Warm. Certain. Happy. The kind of happy I'd spent months trying to understand. Now I finally did. Not because everything was perfect. Because it wasn't. Life was still messy. Complicated. Unpredictable. But for the first time in a very long time, neither of us was hiding. And maybe that was enough. Maybe it was more than enough. A year later, my sister got exactly what she wanted. She stood beside me at another family gathering and watched Connor and me arrive together. Then she rolled her eyes. "What?" I asked. She smirked. "Took you idiots long enough." Connor laughed. I groaned. And my sister looked entirely too pleased with herself. The worst part? She was absolutely right. Some stories begin with a confession. Ours did. But not the one Connor made in that diner. The real confession happened later, when both of us finally stopped being afraid. And after 15 years of friendship, secrets, bad timing, and missed chances, that turned out to be the one that mattered.